The Democratic Alliance is calling for Rand Water CEO Sipho Mosai to be axed. Gauteng DA leader Solly Msimanga said the utility, he adds that the Rand Water failed to prepare for the increased demand and to address the malfunctioning organisation. Well, let's take this conversation further with the DA's Stephen Moore. Mr. Moore, appreciate your time this evening. Now, in that report, your Gauteng leader Solly Msimanga has called for the removal of Rand Water CEO. What specific failures or actions by the CEO have led to this call for his removal?
Thank you for having me, Hugo. And I think it's important to contextualize the actual scope of the problem. Rand Water supplies water to 18 million residents of South Africa, spread across not just Gauteng, but Gauteng, the Free State, Mpumalanga, and parts of the Northwest. And the Zakobosh plant that failed this week wasn't just a plant. It was a plant responsible for 70+% of their entire production, a total of 3,800 megalitres. That is more than the production of Johannesburg, Ekurhuleni, and Tshwane, their usage daily combined. So it's not a small outage, and I hear the focus on Lynmere, but just today I have been to Secunda, I've been to Lesedi, I've been to Ekurhuleni. Yesterday I was in Midrand. All over Gauteng, people have been affected by this outage. And it's not just outage, like I said, Secunda and Mpumalanga. So millions of residents are affected when Rand Water drops the ball, as they did. And electrical infrastructure is vulnerable. It is to lightning storms, but also the Highveld is prone to lightning storms. And if you have a properly maintained network, proper protections in place, they should be resistant, they should be resilient. The expectation the DA has in this situation is that proper maintenance has not been done, and that may not be entirely Rand Water's fault. As we know, Eskom has been causing load shedding. It does damage Rand Water's infrastructure because of the continued load shedding. But the reality is, it doesn't matter whether Eskom is load shedding. Rand Water are expected to provide water, because unlike electricity, without water, lives are at stake. Hospitals can't operate, clinics can't operate, people can't wash, people can't drink. And it's all good to get a water tanker if it's an isolated area, but if all of Gauteng is experiencing problems, where do you get the water from? So when Gauteng, my leader Solly Msimanga says we're concerned about what's happening with Rand Water, it is an enormous crisis, it isn't an isolated event.
Now, when we talk about possible or probable solutions for you, or certainly work that hasn't gone in prior to the devastation that we're seeing at the moment, what needs to be done?
Well, Hugo, I mean, it's relatively simple, and it's one of the big challenges. The population of Gauteng has grown over the last 10 years. About 10 years ago, it was about 12 million people in Gauteng. These days, Rand Water actually supplies around 18 million people with water. So it's 50% more water. The problem is their supply hasn't increased. They produce the same amount of water as they did when there were 12 million people. So suddenly the water is very stretched, and an obvious solution is always just increase the supply. Now, there's a long hope for the Lesotho Highlands project, which is supposed to bring in a huge amount of additional water into Gauteng from Lesotho. But the problem is that project has been waited on for years and years and is only expected, I believe, when I checked last, in 2028 now, many years after it was originally intended to end. So we have to find, where does the water come from? And Rand Water does have on paper a plan to produce additional water. Quite excitingly, they have a upgrade project for what they call Zakobosh Station 5, which they launched phase 1 at the end of August, an additional 150 megalitres, which would have been very exciting if it was operational. But my sources tell me that whilst the plant is blasting at full power, they don't actually include this new module that was launched last month. Additionally, there's beyond that, and I mean, that is critical. Launching that additional capacity, 150 megaliters, will be useful. The second phase of that Station 5 is another 450 megaliters, which will really make a measurable impact. But I'll be honest with you, Hugo, that's only if it's actually launched, if it actually operates when they say it's operating, and the sooner the better, because our supply is not meeting our demand currently, especially during the hotter months. And if we're running out of water now in spring, I'm desperately worried about what's going to happen in summer.
Are we actually running out of water? Because earlier we spoke to the spokesperson of the Water and Sanitation Department, and she seemed to suggest that we do have adequate water supply. The issue is not the availability of water as much as it is the infrastructure to get the water to the people.
Hugo, it's complicated, and one of the big challenges here is the lack of transparency. So as I've said, the population is massively increased. The supply hasn't increased. Now, that logically says there's going to be a challenge. There is an exacerbating feature here, which is the fact that due to failure to maintain municipal infrastructure, and I don't want to paint this as Rand Water are the only ones at fault. This is a shared responsibility. Rand Water, as I've said, are under pressures from problems that Eskom is causing them. There's also problems that they receive from municipalities, whether it's bad payments. But municipalities aren't maintaining their water infrastructure properly. Now, my understanding, and again, getting exact numbers on these is difficult, is that the average municipality in Gauteng loses about 25% of the water that they buy from Rand Water to the ground due to leaks. So, absolutely, there is a sufficient supply. It's like with load shedding. If all of our power plants are working and there are no problems, then there's no load shedding. But the fact is, the second there's any problems with any of Rand Water's supply, it puts additional strain on the already leaky pipes that get water to our residents. And whilst I'd like to say there's sufficient supply, the evidence I'm seeing on the ground, particularly in areas who haven't had sufficient water for a year or two, some areas only get water supply overnight, and that's been the case for over a year, not just this past week, but months or longer. Lesedi, that I visited this morning, hasn't had water for 28 days. Now, that's not a sudden problem at Zakerbosch this week. 28 days says there's a fundamental problem getting water, sufficient water, to Lesedi. Lesedi has its own problems. Its own municipal structure isn't properly maintained, absolutely. But it's not just Lesedi. And I don't want to be pointing fingers back and forth or have the entities point fingers at each other. The reality is we and they need to work together. That's why, from a parliamentary perspective, we went and visited and were doing these investigations, because there is a lot of finger pointing, but there's not a lot of actual high-level strategic looking at, is the supply sufficient for the demand, and what can we do in the short and medium term rather than the long 2028 term to get the water supply protected and stabilized, so that residents like those in Lesedi who haven't had water for 28 days, or those in parts of Secunda who haven't had water for 23 days in a row, get them water. That's got to be key.
Mr. Moore, final question. Sipho Mosai, we talked about it. You said let's put stuff into context. I think you've certainly done that over the last few minutes. So talk to us about him getting axed. In fact, your desire, or the DA, the Gauteng leader's desire to have him axed.
You've got to understand the pressure on the Gauteng leader. The Rand Water are responsible only to the Minister of Water and Sanitation. They don't report to our provincial team. They certainly don't provide any reporting to Solly Msimanga as a member of the provincial legislature. There are avenues you can get information, but they aren't great. And also the communication we receive is sparse to nil, often with incorrect or conflicting information. It makes our leader's position very difficult, especially as a leader of communities across Gauteng that he represents. In the end, you have to look at the top to say who is in charge of preventing transparent communication, who is in charge of ensuring these projects finish on time and are actually activated when we're told in the news they're activated. And as I say, I can understand my leader's frustration, and I'm sure anyone who understands the situation would feel the same pain.